The Call to Courage, Chapter 4, Drums, Part 1. The very next morning, Mafatu set about building his canoe. He had banked his fire the night before in the natural shelter of a cave, and he resolved never to let the sparks die out. For it was altogether too difficult to make fire with the fire stick, and it required too much time. In Haikuru, for that reason, the fires were always kept burning, and it was the special charge of the younger members of a family to see that fuel was ever at hand. Woe unto the small boy who let the family fires go out. While his breakfast roasted in the coals, the boy cleared the brush away from the base of the great tamanu. There was no wood better for canoe building than this. It was tough, durable, yet buoyant in the water. Mafatu could fell his tree by fire and burn it out too. Later he would grind an adze out of basalt for the finished work. The adze would take a long time, but he had made them often in Haikuru, and he knew just how to go about it. The boy was beginning to realize that the hours he had spent fashioning utensils were to stand him now in good stead. Nets and knives and shark line, implements and shell fish hooks. He knew how to make them all. How he had hated those tasks in Haikuru. He was quick and clever with his hands, and now he was grateful for the skill which was his. The fire crackled and snapped about the base of the tamanu tree. When at length it had eaten well into the trunk, Mafatu climbed aloft and crept cautiously out upon a large branch that overhung the beach. Then, taking firm hold of the branches above his head, he began to jump up and down. As the fire ate deeper into the trunk, the tree began to lean under the boy's weight. With a snap and a crash, it fell across the sand. As it fell, Mafatu leaped free of the branches as nimbly as a cat. "That's enough for today, Yuri," he decided. "Tomorrow we'll build our fires down the trunk and start burning it out. When the eaters of men come, we will be ready." In the meantime, there were many other things to do: a fish trap of bamboo, a net of sennet, a fish hook too, if only he could find some bone. And while the canoe was building, how could Mafatu get out to the distant reef to see his trap, unless he first made a raft of bamboo? The boy decided that the raft was of first importance. He chose a score or more of fine bamboos as large around as his arm, felling them by fire. Then he lashed them together with strips of parao bark, making a sturdy raft of 2 thicknesses. It would serve him well until his canoe should be finished. As he worked, his mind returned again and again to the wild pig he was determined to kill. How could he go back to Haikuru with a boar's tooth necklace? Why, that necklace was almost as important as a canoe, for by that token men would know his strength and courage. When the day came that he should leave this high island, he would sail to the north and east. Somewhere in the quarter lay the cloud of islands, the great Tuamotu archipelago, which extends across 1,000 miles of ocean and 10 degrees of latitude. Within those spike-reefed channels floated Haikuru, his homeland. There was no doubt in his mind that he could find it and would find it, for Maui, who had led him safe to this shore, would someday guide him home again. But first, Mafatu knew he must prove himself worthy. Men should never again call him Mafatu, the boy who was afraid, and Tavananui should say with pride, "Here is my son, come home from the sea." Kiwi the albatross came and went on his mysterious errands, emerging out of blue space, vanishing into it again. At sundown, regularly, the white bird came wheeling and circling to alight clumsily on the beach almost at Mafatu's side, while Yuri pranced about and greeted his friend after his own fashion. As for Yuri, he was having the time of his life, for there were countless seabirds nesting along the shore to be chased and put to rout, and wild goats and pigs in the mountains to make life exciting enough for any dog. Mafatu had discovered a mulberry tree. He stripped off the bark and removed the inner white lining. Then he wet the fiber and laid it upon a flat stone and set about beating it with a stick of wood. The fiber spread and grew thinner under the persistent beating. The boy added another strip, wet it, and beat it into the first one, then another and another. Soon he had a yard of cloth, to serve as a pareu. It was soft and white, and now at last he was clothed. Before I go home, I will make a dye of owl and paint a fine design on my pareu, the boy promised himself. I must not go back ill-clothed and empty-handed. He must know that I have conquered the sea, and may the land serve me well. The days passed in a multitude of tasks that kept Mafatu busy from dawn till dark. His lean-to grew into a 3-sided house with bamboo walls and a thatch of palm leaves. The 4th wall was open to the breezes of the lagoon. It was a trim little house, and he was proud of it. A roll of woven mats lay on the floor. There was a shelf in the wall with 3 bowls cut from coconut shells, bonefish, hooks dangling from a peg. There was a coil of tough sennet many feet long, an extra pareu of tapa waterproofed with gum of the artu tree for wet weather. All day long the wind played through the openings in the bamboo walls, and at night lizards scurried through the thatch with soft rustlings. One morning, wandering far down the beach, Mafatu came upon a sheltered cove. His heart gave a leap of joy, for there, white, gleaming in the sun, was all that remained of the skeleton of a whale. It might not have meant very much to you or to me, but to Mafatu it meant knives and fishhooks galore, splintered bone for darts and spears, a shoulder blade for an axe. It was a veritable treasure trove. The boy leaped up and down in his excitement. "Yuri," he shouted, "we're rich. Come help me drag these bones home." His hands seemed all thumbs in his eagerness. He tied as many bones as he could manage into 2 bundles. One bundle he shouldered himself, the other Yuri dragged behind him. And thus they returned to the campsite, weary, but filled with elation. Even the dog seemed to have some understanding of what that discovery meant. Or if not, he was at least infected with his master's high spirits. He leaped about like a supportive puppy, yapping until he was hoarse. Now began the long process of grinding the knife and the axe. Hour after long hour, squatting before a slab of basalt, Mafatu worked and worked until his hands were raw and blistered, and the sweat ran down his eyes. The knife emerged first, since that was the most imperative. Its blade was 10 inches long, its handle a knob of joint. It was sharp enough to cut the fronds of coconut trees, to slice off the end of a green nut. But it was a splendid knife. All Mafatu's skill went into it. It would be a fine weapon as well, the boy thought grimly as he ground it down to a sharp point. Some sea robber had been breaking into his bamboo trap, and he was going to find out who the culprit was. Probably that old hammerhead shark who was always cruising around, just as if he owned the lagoon. Fishing with a line took too long when you were working against time. Mafatu could not afford to have his trap robbed. Twice it had been broken into, the stout bamboos crushed and the contents eaten. It was the work either of a shark or of an octopus, that was certain. No other fish was strong enough to snap the tough bamboo. Mafatu's mouth was set in a grim line as he worked away on his knife. That old hammerhead, undoubtedly, he was the thief. Mafatu had come to recognize him, for every day when the boy went out with his trap, that shark, larger than the others, was circling around, wary and watchful. The other sharks seemed to treat the hammerhead with deference. Hunger alone drove Mafatu out to the reef to set his trap. He knew that if he was to maintain strength to accomplish all that lay ahead, he must have fish to add to his diet of fruit. But often as he set his trap far out by the barrier reef, the hammerhead would approach, roll over slightly in passing, and the cold gleam of his eye filled Mafatu with dread and anger. "Wait, you," the boy threatened darkly, shaking his fist at the mow. "Wait until I have my knife. You will be not so brave then. You will run away when you see a flash." But the morning that the knife was finished, Mafatu did not feel so brave as he would have liked. He hoped he would never see the hammerhead again. Paddling out to the distant reef, he glanced down from time to time at the long-bladed knife where it hung about his neck by a cord of sennet. It wasn't, after all, such a formidable weapon. It was only a knife made by a boy from a whale's rib. Yuri sat on the edge of the raft, sniffing at the wind. Mafatu always took his dog along, for Yuri howled unmercifully if he were left behind, and Mafatu had come to rely upon the companionship of the little yellow dog. The boy talked with the animal as if he were another person, consulting with him, arguing and playing when there was time for play. They were very close, these two. This morning, as they approached the spot where the fish trap was anchored, Mafatu saw the polished dorsal of the hated hammerhead circling slowly in the water. It was like a triangle of black basalt making a little furrow in the water as it passed. "Aye, Mao," the boy shouted roughly, to bolster up his courage. "I have my knife today, see? Coward who robs traps, catch your own fish." The hammerhead approached the raft in leisurely fashion. It rolled over slightly, and its gaping jaws seemed to curve in a yawning grin. Yuri ran to the edge of the raft, barking furiously. The hair on the dog's neck stood up in a bristling ridge. The shark, unconcerned, moved away. Then with a whip of its powerful tail, it rushed at the bamboo fish trap and seized it in its jaws. Mafatu was struck dumb. The hammerhead shook the trap as a terrier might shake a rat. The boy watched, fascinated, unable to make a move. He saw the muscles work in the fish's neck as the great tail thrashed the water to fury. The trap splintered into bits, while the fish within escaped only to vanish into the shark's mouth. Mafatu was filled with impotent rage. The hours he had spent making that trap, but all he could do was shout threats at his enemy. Yuri was running from one side of the raft to the other, furious with excitement. A large wave sheeted across the reef. At that second, the dog's shift in weight tipped the raft at a perilous angle. With a helpless yelp, Yuri slid off into the water. Mafatu sprang to catch him, but he was too late. Instantly, the hammerhead whipped about. The waves slewed the raft away. Yuri, swimming frantically, tried to regain it. There was desperation in the brown eyes, the puzzled eyes so faithful and true. Mafatu strained forward. His dog! His companion! The hammerhead was moving in slowly. A mighty rage stormed through the boy. He gripped his knife. Then he was over the side in a clean, curving dive. Mafatu came up under his enemy. The shark spun about. Its rough hide scraped the flesh from the boy's shoulder. In that instant, Mafatu stabbed deep, deep into the white belly. There was a terrific impact. Water lashed to foam. Stunned, gasping, the boy fought for life and air. It seemed that he would never reach the surface. Ow, his lungs would burst. At last his head broke water. Putting his face to the surface, he saw the great shark turn over fathoms deep. Blood flowed from the wound in its belly. Instantly, gray shapes rushed in, other sharks, tearing the wounded hammerhead to pieces. Yuri, where was he? Mafatu saw his dog then. Yuri was trying to pull himself up on the raft. Mafatu seized him by the scruff and dragged him up to safety. Then he caught his dog to him and hugged him close, talking to him foolishly. Yuri yelped for joy and licked his master's cheek. It wasn't until Mafatu reached shore that he realized what he had done. He had killed the Mao with his own hand, with naught but a bone knife. He could never have done it for himself. Fear would have robbed his arm of all strength. He had done it for Yuri, his dog. And he felt suddenly humble with gratitude. Now the adze was completed, thus the canoe too was beginning to take finished shape. It was 15 feet long, 3 feet deep, and scarcely a foot wide. Often as he worked, the boy would pause to stand off and admire his craft. It was a beautiful canoe. How proud his father would be. Alas, that it was such slow work. When the hole had been hollowed out, it must be smoothed off with the adze and caulked with artu gum. Then a mast must be made of pacati, straight and true, a sail woven from pandanus, and there was rigging to be made of senet, tough and strong as wire. The craft would have been finished sooner if only there were not so many things to interfere. Every day, for example, Mafatu climbed the plateau to his lookout. He had not missed one day since he arrived at the island. He knew that when the eaters of men came, they would sail by day. They would have to beat against the prevailing wind. It would take them many hours to come from Smoking Island. Mafatu would be able to see them from his lookout long before they arrived. If only he could be ready before they came. He must. But that trip up the mountain every day took so much precious time. His canoe would have been finished days ago but for that. Today I will not go, the boy thought, as his adze whirred and chipped. It takes too long. Then he sighed and laid down the adze. Caution was the better part of wisdom. He, picking up his shining spear with its new shaft and turning toward the trail that led to the high plateau, Yuri leaped ahead, his nose keen pointed to the ground. This day, Mafatu climbed the rough trail through the jungle. He was preoccupied, lost in his thoughts. His mind was not on this business at all. He was thinking about the rigging of his canoe, planning how he could strengthen it here, tighten it there. Some instinct of danger must have made him pause, though, warning him to be aware. There it was, just a rustle in the undergrowth, scarcely louder than an insect's hum. The boy drew up tense and listening. Yuri had dashed off on some wild goose chase of his own. The boy stood rooted, alert. He saw it then. A wild boar with lowered head, eyes red with hate, the flash of its wicked tusks. The animal pawed the ground suddenly. Its grunting snort broke the stillness. Mafatu knew a blind impulse to turn and run. Then he drew a deep breath and shouted out a challenge. "Puaviri, wild pig! I, Mafatu, have come to kill you!" The boar charged. Over the ground it tore. Foam flew back from its tusks. The boy braced himself. He met the charge with a perfectly timed thrust of the spear. The boar impaled itself shoulder deep upon the spearhead. Mafatu was thrown off balance, sent spinning headlong. Over and over he rolled. He leaped to his feet in a panic, defenseless, but the boar toppled, gave a convulsive shudder, then lay still. Mafatu was struck dumb. He had killed a wild pig. For a second he could not grasp the wonderful truth of it. Then he leaped wildly into the air, shouting, "Au tuau, I have killed the pua! Do you hear me, Tavanunui? I, your son, have killed a boar! Ho! Ha!" Yuri came leaping out of the jungle and barked himself hoarse at the sight of the pig. "A fine one you are," Mafatu joked at his dog. "Where were you when I needed you? Off chasing butterflies? That's you. Was it for this I saved you from the teeth of the Mao? I've a mind not to give you one mouthful of pau." Yuri hung his head, dropped his tail, then brightened as Mafatu laughed joyously. "Foolish one, here, drag your share." The boy made a rude sled of bamboo and loaded the heavy animal onto it. Then he hitched a stout liana around Yuri's neck, and the dog threw his weight into the task. The two started home in triumph with their burden, Mafatu singing at the top of his lungs a lusty song of blood and battle. He was all Polynesian now, charged with the ancient fierceness of his race. Victory coursed like fire through his veins. There was nothing he would not have dared, nothing he feared. Aye, but life was good. When they reached the campsite, Mafatu built up a roaring fire and set a pile of stones to heat. While the stones were heating, the boy cleaned the pig at the water's edge, then stuffed its empty belly with succulent ti leaves and red bananas. When at last the oven stones were white and smoking, Mafatu dragged the pig back to the fire and rolled it upon the hot umu. Then he covered it with layer upon layer of plantain leaves, dozens of them, to hold in a steam and to allow the pork to cook through slowly. Yuri leaped about, sniffing all the delicious odors, barking his delight. Pork! After weeks of fish and fish and fish, how good it would taste! Besides, fish was not good for dogs, too many bones. Kiwi, no meat-eater, looked on calmly, wondering what all this disturbance was about. The bird was content with a coconut that Mafatu split open for him, that he might join in the feast. Mafatu's mouth fairly watered in anticipation, but even as he settled back to await the feast, his hands were busy. The sun gleamed brightly on the curving tusks that already he was making into a necklace. They formed almost a complete circle and were as white as bleached coral. Ow, how men's tongues would chatter when they saw this fine necklace. Even grandfathers had been no finer. A strange picture on that lonely beach under the palms, a pig roasting on a fire, a boy lean and brown and whip-strong making a boar's tooth necklace, a prancing yellow dog, a calm, wide-winged albatross pecking at a coconut. Mafatu slipped the necklace about his throat, and he could fairly feel its magic, charging him with strength. He pulled the oven stones away from the umu, and there lay the pig, golden, glowing, done to a turn. Rich juices ran in little rivulets down its sides, and as Mafatu ate, one thought alone filled his mind, overshadowing even his enjoyment of this rare feast. Soon, soon now he would be ready. He had killed the Mau, the Puatu. His canoe would soon be completed, and then he would return to Haikuru. The canoe was finished.